Russia is not the Soviet Union in 1945. It is not a global superpower. It's not even really a great power. Yes, it has nuclear weapons, but unless all you want to do is blow up the world, that's a very limited value. In practical terms, on almost any index, Russia is no longer in a position to be able to divide the world. But nonetheless, that's how Putin thinks Russia should be considered. And so, Putin is going to continue to try and push this idea that, well, we, the Americans, and maybe the Chinese, we should be allowed to get together and decide whatever global issue matters to us.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're catching up with a regular on Frontline, Professor Mark Galeotti. Mark is a former advisor to the Foreign Office on Russian foreign and security policy. He's the author of several books about Russia, and the latest is Forged in War, a military history of Russia from its beginnings to today. Mark, great to see you again on Frontline. Thank you for your time. Your latest article for the Times newspaper is called Trump and Putin, the fragile relationship that will change the world, where you examine what you describe as their on-off bromance. Can we just start by rewinding and having a little look at what the relationship was like during Trump's first presidency?
I mean, it was perverse. I say in the article that Trump never seems to have met an autocrat that he didn't like, whether we're talking about Xi Jinping in China or Kim in North Korea. But the Putin relationship was really quite something, in that he kept talking up how well the relationship had been and was going to go. Whenever they met, he often would like to have little sort of personal tete-a-tetes with Putin. And look, inevitably, this created all this kind of palaver about, is he actually compromised by the Russians? But we have to recognize 2 points. One is that if he had been compromised, I imagine that if I had been an agent handler in Yaseneva, the headquarters of Russian foreign intelligence, running Agent Orange, I would have told him to actually damp down all the positive words about Putin, because it almost made it impossible for him precisely to be pro-Russian in any practical way. But also, if we look about it, actually, American policy towards Russia at the end of Trump's first presidency was tougher than it had been at any point since the end of the Cold War. But in part, this is because, frankly, Congress took over Russia policy, but certainly Trump didn't bother exerting any political capital to try and change that. So we have this strange sort of paradox of the warmest of warm words, to the point that was almost embarrassing, and yet policy itself really wasn't particularly affected by this notional affinity.
And why do you think there was a disconnect between the warm words, which you say, which were embarrassing, to the way the policy was being exercised?
Look, I mean, it's hard enough for me to crawl into Putin's mind. To try and head into Trump's as well is frankly asking a lot of me. Now, I mean, but it does seem to be that he has this desire not only to be liked generally, but nonetheless, particularly, he sees himself not as the elected democratic president of a country, but rather the sort of the strongman chief executive officer of USA Incorporated. And he looks to the other strongmen figures, people who aren't held back by these sort of petty issues of law and constitution and basic decency. And those are the kind of guys whose club he wants to be in. So there seems to be that he has this political as well as emotional affinity with the strongmen. But again, when it comes down to it, ultimately Trump is interested in Trump. And he's certainly not going to put himself in peril or even, frankly, exert himself in order to do something for these, as he would see it, fellow strongmen.
And you write that they met 5 times in person. Another is potentially on the cards. The first was in Germany, but the most famous was in Helsinki in 2018. How much do we know about what really went on?
Well, we don't. That's the point. I mean, actually, usually when you have these one-on-one meetings, they're not really one-on-one. Firstly, you've had massive amounts of preparatory work by the so-called Sherpas, the people who are actually going to try and set up the meeting, identify the lines of discussion, etc. Then, when the heads of state go in, there's usually a whole phalanx, not just of an interpreter, clearly needed in this case, but also of advisors and observers and such like. They each had their own interpreter, who was clearly sworn to secrecy, and that's it. So there was no contemporaneous written record. All we have to go on is what Putin and Trump said about that meeting, which is, let's be honest, not exactly the soundest evidentiary base.
Yeah, and afterwards, after that one in Helsinki, Trump sided with Putin against the FBI, saying he was willing to take the Russian president's word, take him at his word, that the Kremlin had not tried to interfere in the US elections. That was quite a stunning thing to say at the time, wasn't it? Why do you think he came out with that?
Well, he wasn't really, if you think about it, siding with Putin. Again, he was siding with himself, because the whole point was he was actually saying, well, Putin told me he didn't try and rig the election for me.
Suits me to believe him.
Exactly. I mean, this is it. So I think, we have to appreciate the extent to which actually the single sort of through line explaining Trump's policies has been his own self-interest. And so from this point of view, of course, he was going to say he believed Putin.
And when an attempt was made on Donald Trump's life on the campaign trail in September, Putin called Trump courageous and manly, another cringeworthy kind of comment. He used it to flatter Trump, but also to push his own narrative, didn't he? Because he'd take a little bit of a pot shot at the circumstances under which that kind of attempt would be made.
Yes. I mean, obviously Putin has identified the fact that the way to Trump's heart is through his ego, and uses every opportunity to flatter him. But we've seen this line actually coming out from several sort of commentators of the sort who tend to sort of channel Kremlin talking points in Russia, is that the thing about Trump is that if he tries to break too much with the interests of the American deep state, then, he may well face another assassination attempt. So what they're trying to do is basically do two things. One is to suggest that, in fact, the American deep state is this violent, conspiratorial, vicious creature, so unlike Russian politics. But at the same time, there's an element of expectation management. They're trying to explain why, in fact, Donald Trump may well not be able to provide that kind of easy, quick end to the Ukraine war that they would like.
How do you think Trump and Putin have been positioning themselves then ahead of any talks, the end of the fighting in Ukraine? Because they both want to come out of this looking as though they came out on top.
Yes, well, look, Trump's line is very much, essentially, we have to end this war because it's wasteful of human lives, and frankly, it's a distraction. Putin, of course, doesn't just want to end the war. He wants to end the war on his terms. And I think what he's trying to do is basically sort of set up a situation in which two things. First of all, that he tries to present the Ukrainians as the obstacle. President Zelensky of Ukraine did indeed pass a decree saying that he could not have personal negotiations with Putin. Now, look, that doesn't stop. The fact is, it doesn't stop his foreign minister, all his various staffers from doing that. But nonetheless, that has given Putin a good line, particularly when, again, playing to this personalistic type of politics that Trump enjoys. Zelensky has ruled himself out. So you and I, the big boys, essentially, have to actually sort of sort this out. So I think very much Putin, again, he's flattering Trump. He's trying to suggest that it's for Trump to actually negotiate on Ukraine's part, which is, after all, if you think about an extraordinary intrusion into Ukrainian sovereignty. And in fact, there was a line that came out later in the Russian press that essentially said, well, look, America has paid for this war, so America should have the right to be able to decide how it ends. Now, that's not how the world works, but it is how Trump's world works.
And how serious, though, do you think were Trump's threats to impose tariffs, taxes and sanctions on Russia unless Putin will enter talks, which were made just days after his inauguration?
Yeah, it's interesting that Trump definitely presented quite a harder line on Russia than we might have expected. But no, how serious is Trump on anything? I think that we are in a position in which, to a degree, he has staked a certain amount of his political capital on achieving something in Ukraine. Now, I personally feel that a ceasefire is possible, maybe, but a proper peace negotiation, I wish it was likely, but I don't really see it necessarily happening this year. I'd love to be proven wrong. But the point is that from Trump's point of view, he needs to have something now to deliver. And if the Russians are the ones who will be stopping that, then I think he will be peeved, to say the least.
But when he went, I know it's difficult to know what he really means when he speaks, but when he went as far as saying that Putin was not doing so well and that the war was destroying Russia, he knows that if that gets any kind of publicity or airtime in the Russian Federation, that will not be something that pleases Putin.
Yeah, but precisely things that don't please Putin do not get airtime. I mean, yes, they spread through social media and so forth, but we haven't seen it on Russian television that way. And look, I mean, yes, on the one hand, that was quite unexpected. But then, if we also think about that whole statement in which he threatened tariffs, he also made the point about, well, he actually exaggerated how many Soviets died in World War II. But he made the point about how he wasn't an enemy of the Russian people and so forth. You know, when we're dealing with someone who is, shall we say, so elephantine as Donald Trump and so likely just sort of step in accidental ways, I don't know if we can necessarily parse each individual phrase too much. But what is clear is that he's coming out saying he wants a deal. He's willing to basically, wave a stick at the Ukrainians, but he is at the least making the noises to suggest that he would also be willing, if need be, if the Russians seem to be the ones stopping any kind of ceasefire, to also wave a stick at them.
Do you think the two of them have some kind of understanding in the way that they communicate? Is there some kind of subtext there? Because when Putin made that kind of, as you describe it, the ultimate ego stroke, blaming the so-called stolen victory of the 2020 presidential elections for the crisis in Ukraine, do you think he thinks he can manipulate Trump, or he's just ingratiating himself at that particular moment? I mean, is there an understanding of what we say in public is nothing to do with the understanding we have in private?
I mean, I don't think there's any kind of secret understanding between them. But what I do think is there is precisely kind of this strange asymmetrical assumptions. I mean, I think, from Trump's point of view, he sees himself as the big dog. But nonetheless, he is aware that there are other big dogs around, and he wants to be in the pack in that respect. So he expects to be treated with a certain amount of respect and indeed deference. But I don't think he kind of thinks of it beyond that point. Putin clearly is a much more sophisticated operator, a cynical operator. He knows precisely how to stroke Trump's ego. But also, if we look at other leaders, including Western leaders, with whom he's managed to get on. And you think of, for example, Italy's Silvio Berlusconi, another character who could be considered colourful, let's say. Actually, again, Putin does seem to have a genuine affinity for these kind of fairly flamboyant, definitely authoritarian, definitely deeply, deeply self-indulgent type of, non-political politicians. So, I mean, I think it's not just about manipulating Donald Trump. I think it is also that, in fact, Putin does kind of feel a little bit more at home with them than with the rather more grey characters who make up most countries' leaderships.
Do you believe that the traditional diplomatic way of doing things doesn't work anymore? And if so, why not?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's already been dying. I mean, let's be honest, diplomatic connections between Russia and the West have almost entirely withered. And that's obviously particularly since the February 22 invasion and the phenomenally brutal and ugly way in which the Russians have conducted themselves. But it's also, I think, to a degree, because we have shot ourselves in the foot. We wanted to have that kind of hit of moral certitude that says, no, we're going to cut this particular communication channel and we're going to kick up these people. I mean, expelling spies from embassies absolutely makes sense, but closing down some of the communications channels and things, that I think was a blunder. So there's a little bit of our blame there. Primarily, it's the Russians who eagerly insist on tit for tat and so forth. But it's also precisely that now, as we enter the era of Trump, and Trump, I think it's fair to say, will probably define the next 4 years of international relations, we are entering a realm in which, first of all, personalistic politics really do matter. Trump clearly likes people and dislikes people and allows that to influence his policymaking in a way that one wouldn't expect in most countries. Secondly, Trump's notion of politics is incredibly transactional. I mean, if we just look at what happened with Colombia, that when the Colombians said, no, we're not going to take returning illegal immigrants on military planes, immediately he threatens a 25% tariff slapped on them. Now, that's just not the way politics tends to work. And look, some people might actually wish we could go back to that. This is the equivalent of gunboat diplomacy in an interconnected modern financial age. So I think this is what we all have to cope with. And we can try and not get sucked into that world, but we can't pretend it doesn't exist.
And how do you think Donald Trump's imperialistic noises to reclaim the Panama Canal, annex Greenland, even Canada, will have gone down in Moscow?
Oh, the Russians are loving this. I mean, this is the answer to all their prayers. Even if nothing happens, and frankly, the thought of American Marines landing in Greenland or whatever is the stuff of their dreams. But, so even if none of these various threats come to pass, first of all, it's a huge distraction. And that, from their point of view, is one of Donald Trump's great virtues. He is the ultimate distractor and disruptor. Secondly, though, it allows them to play one of their well-worn and often quite effective propaganda lines, which is to say, look, we're not saying we're angels. We're just saying we're no worse than everyone else. And the spectacle of America at least threatening to do precisely the things that Russia is being held in the international dock of public opinion for is a great sort of boon, not just inside Russia, but actually around the world. I mean, the Russians have been very good, particularly in the global south, of actually presenting them as the wounded party compared with this sort of imperialistic, hegemonic, colonialist West. And that has gone down quite well in a lot of countries whose experiences of Western colonialism has been at the hands of the British or the French or the Germans or the Italians or the Belgians or whoever. This sort of with America beginning to really throw its weight around in a really clumsy way, I think it is also going to be very good for Russian propagandists in the global south.
And you write that Putin tried to invoke the Yalta spirit at the end of the Second World War in his congratulations towards Trump when he won the election. Can you expand, when he was inaugurated, can you expand on this and how much does it tell us about his vision of the world?
Yeah, look, the Yalta summit where Stalin, Churchill and FDR sat down and basically apportioned certainly sort of Europe between them. Greece can go to the west, but the occupied countries of Central Europe, they can be part of the Soviet sphere of influence. That is definitely, well, firstly, it fits, ironically enough, both Putin's and Trump's visions of how the world should be organized. Putin in particular, he has a very kind of 19th century, almost colonial view of the world. That there are a handful of countries that really matter. And the rest, they are just simply spaces on the global risk game board. The only real question is who gets to sort of tell them what to do or who gets to own them. I mean, this is the whole thing about Ukraine. Putin thinks that Ukraine doesn't have agency. The only question is, does the West get to have Ukraine or does Russia? And he wants it to be Russia. So, I mean, in that context, this is how both men really think the world is handled. That it's about the big powers, the great powers, dividing things between them. The irony is, of course, that Russia is not the Soviet Union in 1945. It is not a global superpower. It's not even really a great power. Yes, it has nuclear weapons, but unless all you want to do is blow up the world, that's a very limited value. In practical terms, on almost any index, Russia is no longer in a position to be able to divide the world. But nonetheless, that's how Putin thinks Russia should be considered. And so, Putin is going to continue to try and push this idea that, well, we, the Americans, and maybe the Chinese, we should be allowed to get together and decide whatever global issue matters to us.
And this kind of hubris, you believe, may be the undoing, in a way, of Putin, in that he may overplay his hand in any upcoming meetings with Donald Trump. What is the fear amongst those close to him?
Yeah, the fear is that at the moment, Putin particularly is looking quite cocky. He's seeing his forces continue to slowly grind forward in Ukraine. He's seeing all sorts of divisions in the West. And there is that sense that a man who clearly enjoys mind games and petty exercises of power, remember, this is a man who kept the Pope waiting for an hour. This is a man who, again, as I mentioned in the article, knowing that former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs, nonetheless, brought his great big Labrador into the room. This is really playground stuff, but nonetheless, clearly Putin gets a kick out of that. And the fear, and this is something I actually had from speaking to someone who back in the day had actually briefed Putin early in his presidential career and was saying the thing about Putin nowadays is 25 years in power, he thinks he knows it all, he thinks it knows it better than everyone else, and that he may well not listen to his briefers and precisely try some kind of little petty one-upmanships with Trump, exactly the sort of thing that Trump would respond badly to. And the thing is that whereas the Biden administration was quite cautious, the sense is that if Trump turns against Russia, then all bets will be off.
And what do you think he's capable of if Trump does turn against Russia?
Well, again, I mean, there's what Trump's initial impulse would be, and there will be what, in some ways, the Pentagon and the rest of the machine would allow him to do. I mean, I think in practice, what we would just simply see is not just a lot more assistance being provided to Ukraine, but all the old limitations on how Ukraine could use these missiles and other systems taken away. So basically, more or less Trump egging on the Ukrainians to do their worst, but also sabotage. The Ukrainians carry out campaigns of sabotage. We might well find a lot of more CIA assistance for that.
So really what President Zelensky should be hoping for is that Putin does exactly that and overplays his hand with Donald Trump and annoys him so that he actually supports Ukraine more.
Yeah, and certainly that's something that we are getting now from various Ukrainian officials and commentators and so forth. There is that sense that although at first there was quite a lot of dismay about Trump's election in Kyiv, because Trump and Zelensky do not have a good relationship. And at the moment, the decision by the American administration to suddenly block all some non-military aid programs is clearly also having quite a serious impact in Ukraine itself. But nonetheless, there is that sense that whereas Biden stood for, in a way, slow, measured defeat, with Trump, it's much more of a, toss a coin. Heads we lose, tails we win, but basically there is a chance that, frankly, they didn't think, certainly in the last year or so, the Biden administration was giving them.
You mentioned earlier that after 25 years in power, President Putin may well not be listening to any of his aides anymore. And we've spoken before about the influence of his former security chief, Nikolai Patrushev, who is now his presidential aide. And I think you told me that he had this potentially strong influence during the COVID lockdown of pouring poison into his ear and influences his worldview. What's happened to him? And is there anybody, do you think, who has Putin's ear now?
There are people who have Putin's ear, but they're almost all much less visible because if you're a real Putin confidant, you don't bother going into government. You basically go into business, make sure that the state provides you with huge contracts or whatever, and become obscenely rich. Why bother going to the hassle of actually running anything? Patrushev really seems to be moving out of the president's inner circle. He's increasingly now being sort of trotted out to do lengthy radio or TV or newspaper interviews in which he lambasts the evil Anglo-Saxons, Brits and the Americans, for all our conspiratorial bad work and such like, which tends to be a sign of someone who's on the out but trying desperately to retain Putin's ear. This is the interesting thing at the moment, that actually it's very hard to sort of chart a geography of Putin's inner circle. There are people he gets on with. There are people he tells what to do. There doesn't seem to be anyone who kind of bridges the gap, who actually has policy relevance and experience and knowledge. And Patrushev, for all that I frankly regarded him as about the most dangerous man in Russia, nonetheless did have, he was smart, he had experience. There aren't people like that who are still in his circle, which means that we are so much more dependent now on what Putin himself thinks and what people who have no real experience, but nonetheless might well have been the last person to talk to him on some particular topic, may well be advising him.
Do you think that in that light, then, he's becoming more isolated?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a classic pattern for dictators and autocrats over time. Their circle of people that they listen to and trust shrinks and shrinks. Their willingness to listen to alternative perspectives, someone who actually might say, it's not like that, diminishes. The tolerance simply for people who know what they're doing. I mean, we've seen this, for example, with Elvira Nabiullina, who is the chairwoman of the Russian Central Bank, phenomenally capable banker. In some ways, she's the one who should be getting all the medals, because that's, very much her work has allowed the Russian economy to remain as effective and stable as it has. But even Nabiullina now seems to be sort of out of favor. He's getting a bit snippy about her, simply because she can't wave a magic wand and bring down inflation the way he'd like it to be done. Increasingly, there is this sense of a man who no one can really question, who gives orders and expects those orders to come to pass, even when those orders actually are pretty much impossible to arrange. I mean, these are all the kind of classic signs of the sort of late stage, the senile stage of an authoritarian regime. And, it's one of the reasons why I think that although the Russian state still has a lot of capacity within it, Putin himself, I think, has outlived his capacities to evolve and, frankly, to manage this country.
So where do you see this going in the next, the ensuing 5 years or so?
Well, I mean, in terms of Putin, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think he's going anywhere. I mean, this is a system which is built really to ensure that there can be no real challenge to the leader. So many overlapping and competing security apparatuses that balance each other. Very hard to have a political coup against him. Likewise, incredibly hard for any kind of public organization, unless there's something really that starts to sort of shatter. Instead, this is a bit like the old days of the Brezhnev's Soviet Union back in the 1970s, just in fast forward, slow, shabby slide down into stagnation and such like. I think really we're all just waiting for that day when Putin doesn't wake up. And that's where we're at.
And to return to the subject of where we're going with the war in Ukraine, can we just talk briefly about the position of President Xi of China? How much influence does he have over Putin? And where do his loyalties or interests lie when Donald Trump, for example, asks him to help stop Russia's war on Ukraine?
In some ways, I mean, well, firstly, if Xi really was given the opportunity to end the war by the Americans, that would actually be a really difficult dilemma for him. Because look, on the whole, China has its interests, Russia has its. I mean, at the moment, there is some kind of an alliance because they both feel that the current sort of Western-led global order does not really suit them, but it's a deeply pragmatic transactional one. The Russians know that they can't ultimately trust the Chinese. The Chinese are not going to go out of their way to support the Russians. This war is one that, frankly, the Chinese don't mind. I mean, I don't think it's that they see huge benefits, but it forces the Russians to be more and more dependent upon Beijing. It keeps the West distracted. But the chance to actually be the ones to end the war, to be the peace brokers, I mean, that would be a massive fillip for China. China has been trying to present itself, especially again in the global south, as the kind of the new, not just the new player on the global scene, but the grown-up player. I mean, they have used Ukraine as a way of saying, look, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, they're all busy fighting, they're all busy competing, they can't solve anything. All they're trying to do is put sanctions on you and drag them into their conflict. So I think that really might be quite a temptation. But that said, I don't think that Xi would want Putin to lose. He would want to broker some kind of peace that Putin can then take to his own people and say, look, we've sorted this out. And that's not necessarily what the West would want.
And also unlikely that Donald Trump would want President Xi to be the one to be seen who ended the war either.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, Trump, as ever, he throws out all sorts of potential ideas and talking points. But when it comes down to it, a major global event that does not have Trump center stage, I don't think that's really what he has in mind.
If we could just talk a little bit about the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp Auschwitz, which was commemorated this week. Quite interesting to see what Vladimir Putin said on that day and his comments, because he was using it as an opportunity really to sort of put his slant on history. How do you see that as in the way he's evolving his revisionist kind of stance on history?
Yes, well, obviously it ties in with this ludicrous idea that Ukraine is a neo-Nazi state. And therefore, the fact that Auschwitz was liberated by Soviet soldiers, which kind of has become elided into Russian soldiers, even though we must remember that those Soviet soldiers also included a lot of Belarusians and a lot of Ukrainians, as well as all the other nationalities of the USSR. But nonetheless, the fact that Russia was not present and that Soviet symbols were not shown in a death camp which was liberated by Soviet soldiers allows him to do two things. One is just basically play the victim. Why are the sacrifices of all of our compatriots to save the world from Nazism being sort of ignored and excluded and such like? And secondly, to again make this point of, when it comes down to it, we are the ones who are fighting Nazis. And isn't it a shame that the West is celebrating the liberation of Auschwitz, but nonetheless supporting the neo-Nazis of Ukraine. And I don't think he expects this to have any real traction in the West, but it still does have traction at home. I mean, the Great Patriotic War, as they call it, the Second World War, is still something that genuinely unites so many Russians. And therefore, everything that he gets a chance to not just say, remember our glories, but the West is denying them, that's a good propaganda line for him.
And just finally, Mark, you write about the fragile relationship between Trump and Putin. And to return to the title of your article in the Times, how will it change the world?
Well, precisely, I think we have to recognise that we're entering a world in which I think all the old assumptions about that the baseline was the etiquette of the liberal world order, in which things would be sorted out consensually through discussion and through multinational bodies and UN resolutions and all that. Frankly, it was already fraying very, very substantially. But now I think, Trump is actually going to just rip right through what's left. And look, it doesn't mean to say that we're entering into some kind of dog-eat-dog world of anarchy, because as I said, we can, as individual nations, as alliances and so forth, still choose to decide how we interact with each other. But these kind of platitudes about the way the world works, that for so long, particularly Western democratic, European democratic governments tended to sort of trot out, and pretty much everyone realized was a bit of an old imagined order. I think we have to recognize that doesn't exist. And if there's going to be a new world order, we actually have to build it.
Mark Galeotti, great to speak to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.